The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds when David pulled his rental car into the parking lot of Sunset Luxury Motors. He'd been awake since 5, too excited to sleep. After months of paperwork, legal meetings, and negotiations that seemed to drag on forever, he was finally here. This was his newest business investment, and he couldn't wait to see it with his own eyes. David wasn't your typical businessman who inherited wealth or got lucky with one big break. He'd started from the bottom, washing cars at a small lot when he was just 17. Now at 52, he owned 8 car dealerships across 3 states. Each one had a story, but this particular place was special. It had been losing money for years, and everyone told him he was crazy to buy it. But David saw something others didn't. He saw potential. He'd planned this visit weeks ago, coordinating with the legal team to make sure everything was ready. The previous owner had kept the sale quiet, handling everything through lawyers and investment firms. Most of the staff had no idea the place had even been sold. David liked it that way. He wanted to see how things really worked when nobody knew the boss was watching. Looking down at his clothes, David almost laughed. He'd driven straight from checking on another property across town and hadn't bothered to change. Just jeans, sneakers, and a regular polo shirt. Nothing fancy. He grabbed his clipboard from the passenger seat and headed toward the gleaming showroom. The building was impressive, all glass and steel, with luxury cars positioned like pieces of art under perfect lighting. Through the windows, he could see salespeople in sharp suits talking to customers. Everything looked professional from the outside. But David had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. That's why he was here, to see the truth behind the polished exterior. As he walked toward the entrance, David noticed a few people inside glancing his way. Their expressions weren't exactly welcoming. One man in a particularly expensive-looking suit seemed to be heading straight for the door. David smiled, thinking maybe someone had recognized him from the business listings, even though he'd always kept a low profile, but the man wasn't smiling back. The door swung open, and before David could even say hello, the man stepped outside and held up his hand like a traffic cop. His name tag read General Manager, and his face was turning an unusual shade of red. "Stop right there," the manager said loudly. "I don't know what you're doing here, but this isn't the place for it." David blinked, confused. "Excuse me? I have an appointment for a walkthrough today. I don't care what you think you have," the manager interrupted, his voice getting louder. "This is a luxury car dealership. We serve a certain type of customer. You need to leave before this becomes a situation." For a moment, David just stood there, trying to process what was happening. In all his years in business, he'd faced plenty of challenges, but this was something else entirely. He reached for his wallet, thinking he'd just show his ID and clear up the misunderstanding. "Sir, if you'd just let me explain." "I'm not interested in explanations," the manager snapped. He turned and gestured to 2 security guards who were now approaching from inside the building. "Escort this man off the property. Now." David felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice calm. Years of experience had taught him that losing your temper never helped anything. "This is a mistake. I'm supposed to be here. If you'd just make a phone call to your corporate office." The security guards were on either side of him now. They looked uncomfortable, but they were following orders. One of them spoke quietly. "Sir, we need you to leave the premises." Through the showroom windows, David could see other staff members watching. Some looked curious. Others were actually laughing. One younger salesman was giving the manager a high five. The whole scene felt surreal, like something from a different era that should have been left in the past. David took a deep breath and nodded to the security guards. "I'm going. No need to make this worse than it already is." He walked back to his rental car, his clipboard still in hand, feeling the eyes of everyone in that showroom burning into his back. As he opened his car door, he heard the manager's voice carry across the parking lot. "And don't come back unless you can actually afford to shop here." Sitting in his car, David didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there for a minute, letting it all sink in. He'd been judged, dismissed, and humiliated based on nothing but his appearance and the color of his skin. And if this had happened to him, the actual owner of the dealership, how many regular customers had been treated the same way? How many people had walked away from this place feeling exactly like he did right now? He pulled out his phone and started making calls. First to his lawyer, then to his operations director, then to his head of human resources. He didn't yell or rant. He just explained what happened and asked questions. Where exactly did we go wrong in evaluating this location? What else don't we know? Who else has been treated this way? Then David drove to a coffee shop down the street, ordered a black coffee, and opened his laptop. For the next 3 hours, he went through every single file he had on Sunset Luxury Motors. Employee records, sales reports, customer complaints, financial statements, everything. The more he read, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just one manager having a bad day. This was a pattern, a culture. And tomorrow, David decided as he closed his laptop, that culture was going to change. The next morning, Robert Hartley walked into Sunset Luxury Motors, feeling like he owned the world. The general manager had spent the previous evening at his country club, telling everyone who would listen about how he'd handled a situation at work. His friends had laughed and patted him on the back, congratulating him for maintaining the dealership's standards. Robert felt proud, like he'd done something important. What Robert didn't know was that at 6 o'clock that same morning, David had already entered the building through the back service entrance. He'd brought his lawyer, 2 corporate auditors, and his VP of operations. The only person who'd known to let them in was Lisa Chen, the dealership's chief financial officer. She'd been horrified when she heard what happened yesterday and had immediately offered to help in any way she could. By the time Robert strolled through the front door at 9:30, an hour and a half after the dealership had opened, David was sitting in Robert's own office. The desk was covered with files, printouts, and highlighted documents. 3 years' worth of records were spread out like pieces of a puzzle that was finally coming together. Robert never arrived early. That was one of the first things David had noticed in the employment records. The general manager, who was supposed to set an example for everyone else regularly, showed up late and left early. But nobody had ever called him out on it because, well, he was the general manager. Lisa intercepted Robert in the hallway before he could get to his office. She looked nervous, twisting her hands together. "Robert, there's someone here who needs to speak with you." "The new owner?" Robert laughed out loud. "New owner? What are you talking about?" "Mr. Henderson would never sell this place without telling me first. We've known each other for 15 years. This has to be some kind of joke." Lisa's face was pale. "It's not a joke. Please, just come with me." Robert followed her down the hall, still chuckling to himself. But when he walked into his office and saw David sitting behind his desk, the laughter died in his throat. His face went through a series of changes. First confusion, then recognition, then pure horror. You're the guy from yesterday." Robert stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. David gestured calmly to the chair across from the desk. "Please sit down. We have quite a bit to discuss." Robert's legs seemed to move on their own. He sat down heavily, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of mistake. David slid a folder across the desk. "My name is David Chen. I'm the owner of Wellington Automotive Group. 6 weeks ago, I purchased this dealership along with 4 others in the region through Henderson Holdings. The sale was kept quiet for legal and business reasons. But as of last month, I own this building, the inventory, and everything in it." Robert's hands were shaking as he opened the folder. Inside were purchase agreements, legal documents, all bearing official signatures and seals. This was real. This was actually happening. "Now," David continued, his voice steady but carrying unmistakable authority, "let's talk about yesterday. You physically blocked me from entering my own property. You made assumptions about who I was and what I could afford based solely on how I looked. You had security escort me out. But here's the thing, Robert. That's just the tip of the iceberg." David opened another folder, much thicker than the first. "Over the past 3 years, this dealership has seen sales drop by 34%. Customer reviews have tanked. You've had 17 formal discrimination complaints filed and not a single one was properly investigated. Would you like to know why?" Robert tried to speak, but his mouth had gone dry. No words came out. The door opened and the audit team walked in carrying more boxes of files. David continued, "You've been coming in late and leaving early for over a year. Your sales team has the highest turnover rate in the entire region. People quit faster here than anywhere else I own. And I found something particularly interesting in these emails." David turned his laptop screen so Robert could see it. Email after email showed a clear pattern. Messages about focusing on the right kind of customers and not wasting time on people who probably can't afford anything anyway. There were notes about steering certain customers away from premium vehicles and toward cheaper options. regardless of their actual financial situation. This email here, David pointed to one in particular. You told your team to focus on luxury buyers. You wrote, and I quote, "You know the type. Don't waste time on tire kickers." But here's what's interesting, Robert. I went through the records of people you and your team labeled as tire kickers. Do you know what I found? Robert shook his head, unable to speak. 72% of them were minorities, and 60% of those people were actually pre-approved for financing. They had good credit, stable jobs, and real money to spend, but they never got the chance because your team made assumptions just like you did with me yesterday. David leaned back in his chair. There's more. I found records showing that several customers were told their financing fell through when it had actually been approved. I found notes about hiding premium inventory from certain customers, and I found evidence that you've been steering high-value clients to another dealership in exchange for kickbacks. Robert's face had gone completely white. I can explain. No, David said firmly. You can't, because there's no explanation that makes any of this okay. You didn't just insult me yesterday, Robert. You showed me exactly what's been killing this business. You showed me why good people don't want to work here and why customers don't come back. David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the showroom floor where employees were trying to look busy, while clearly wondering what was happening. Your employment here is terminated effective immediately, for cause. You'll receive the minimum required by law, nothing more. Security will escort you out, and you have 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings. Robert finally found his voice. You can't do this. I have a contract. I'll sue. David turned back to face him. Read the termination clause in your contract. Fraud, discrimination, and breach of fiduciary duty are all grounds for immediate dismissal. And Robert, I've already turned over evidence of the kickback scheme to the authorities. I'd suggest you get yourself a good lawyer. You're going to need one. 2 security guards entered the office, the same ones who had escorted David out yesterday. They wouldn't make eye contact with Robert as they stood by the door waiting. David sat back down at the desk. Oh, and Robert? How did it feel when those guards escorted you out? Because that's exactly how you made me feel yesterday. The difference is I actually did something wrong. As Robert was led out of the office, his legs barely supporting him, David pulled out his phone. There were dozens of calls to make, policies to change, and a whole dealership culture to rebuild. But for the first time since he'd bought this place, David felt like he understood what he was really dealing with. This wasn't just about fixing a struggling business. This was about fixing something much deeper, something that had been broken for a very long time. Word spread through the dealership like wildfire. The man Robert had kicked out yesterday was actually the owner, the new boss, the person who now controlled everyone's future. People who had laughed and high-fived Robert yesterday were now desperately trying to remember if they'd been part of the scene. Some were already updating their resumes. David called a mandatory meeting for 11 o'clock. Every manager and senior salesperson had to attend. As people filed into the conference room, you could cut the tension with a knife. Nobody knew if they still had a job. Nobody knew what was coming next. 17 people sat around that long table, some staring at their hands, others stealing nervous glances at each other. David stood at the head of the table with his lawyer and HR director on either side. He let the silence hang for a moment before speaking. Good morning. I'm David Chen, and I now own this dealership. I'm going to be straight with you because I respect your time and you deserve honesty. Yesterday, I was denied entry to this building. I was judged, dismissed, and humiliated based on nothing but my appearance. But here's the thing. What happened to me isn't the real problem. He clicked a remote and a screen behind him lit up with a presentation. The real problem is that what happened to me yesterday has been happening to customers for years. And most of you knew about it. The slide showed customer complaint letters, reviews from websites, and internal emails that the audit team had found. One email from Robert to the sales team read, "Focus on the luxury buyers. You know the type. Don't waste time on the wrong crowd." Another showed a conversation where a salesperson was told to move a minority customer toward used cars instead of the new model they'd asked about. Even though their credit was excellent, there were reviews from customers too. A military veteran wrote about how he'd been followed around the showroom like he was going to steal something. A doctor described being told that a particular car was probably out of her price range before anyone even asked about her budget. A business owner talked about waiting 40 minutes for service while salespeople helped other customers who came in after him. David let the slides speak for themselves. The room was completely silent except for the hum of the projector. A young woman named Katie finally raised her hand. She'd only been working there for about 8 months. "Mr. Chen, I want you to know that some of us didn't realize how bad this was. I've always tried to treat every customer the same. I didn't know others weren't doing that." David nodded. "I know, Katie. The audit showed me who has clean records and who doesn't. I can see your customer reviews. I can see that people specifically asked for you because you made them feel respected. This meeting isn't about punishing everyone. It's about accountability and deciding what happens next." He paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. "Robert is gone. Terminated this morning. But he's not the only one leaving. 3 senior managers who enabled and encouraged this culture are also being let go. Their last day is today." You could hear people breathing. Someone's phone buzzed and they frantically silenced it. "For the rest of you, I'm offering a choice," David continued. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his posture relaxing slightly. "You can stay and help me rebuild this place the right way. That means mandatory training on fair treatment and discrimination. It means transparent sales practices where we treat every customer with respect regardless of what they look like or what car they drive. It means a new commission structure that rewards excellent service to everyone, not just people you think have money." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Or you can take a severance package and leave with a neutral reference. No hard feelings. But if you stay, you're committing to change. You're committing to being part of the solution, not the problem." David stood up again. "I started my first dealership when I was 25 years old. I had nothing. No family money, no connections, just a dream and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. I built my business on one simple principle: treat people right. Every person who walks through that door deserves respect. I don't care if they're buying a $50,000 car or just looking at brochures. Everyone deserves to be treated like they matter." An older salesman named Phil spoke up. He'd been there for almost 10 years. "Mr. Chen, I'm not going to lie to you. I went along with things I shouldn't have. I didn't speak up when I saw problems because I was scared of losing my job. But I want to do better. I want to stay and learn the right way." Several people nodded in agreement. Katie was wiping tears from her eyes. Another salesperson, a guy named Trevor, raised his hand. "I have a question. What about the customers who were treated badly? Are we going to reach out to them?" David smiled for the first time that morning. "That's exactly the kind of thinking I want to see, Trevor. Yes, we're going to reach out. We're going to apologize to every person who filed a complaint. We're going to review cases where financing was mysteriously denied, and we're going to make it right." Over the next 2 weeks, things started to change. 4 people took the severance package and left. They couldn't or wouldn't adapt to the new way of doing things. But 13 people stayed, including Katie and Trevor and Phil. David brought in trainers from his other dealerships to teach proper sales techniques and customer service. He worked on the floor himself several days a week, watching how people interacted with customers and offering guidance. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Some longtime customers complained about the changes. One man actually said he preferred when the dealership was more exclusive. David politely explained that exclusive and discriminatory weren't the same thing, and if the man wasn't comfortable with the new policies, there were other dealerships he could visit. The local news picked up the story. The headline read, "Dealership owner exposes years of discrimination after being kicked out of his own business." The story went viral on social media. Some people praised David for his transparency and courage. Others accused him of making too big a deal out of one incident. David held a town hall meeting at the dealership, opening the doors to anyone in the community who wanted to share their experiences. Over 100 people showed up. The stories they told were heartbreaking. A teacher who'd been ignored for 30 minutes. A nurse who'd been asked if she was sure she could afford the payment. A firefighter who'd been steered away from the car he wanted because the salesperson assumed it was too expensive for him. But there were good stories, too. Katie shared how she'd struggled with whether to report what she was seeing, afraid she'd be fired or pushed out. Now she was being promoted to sales manager, and she was determined to build a team that reflected the community. Trevor talked about his own parents being treated poorly at a dealership when he was a kid, and how he'd promised himself he'd never make anyone feel that way. David stood on the showroom floor that night after everyone had gone home. The building was quiet. He looked around at the gleaming cars, the polished floors, the fancy lighting. None of that mattered if people didn't feel welcome here. None of it meant anything if customers were judged before they even walked through the door. He pulled out his phone and looked at a photo from that morning. It showed the new team gathered together. Diverse faces, different backgrounds, all committed to the same goal. David smiled. This was just the beginning. The real work was still ahead. But for the first time since he'd bought this place, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. 3 weeks into the transformation, David was learning that change wasn't just difficult. It was messy, complicated, and sometimes downright frustrating. The training sessions were going well and most of the team was adapting. But the real test came when customers walked through the door. On a Tuesday afternoon, a well-dressed older man walked into the showroom asking for Robert by name. Katie approached him with a friendly smile. "I'm sorry, sir, but Robert no longer works here." "I'm Katie, the sales manager. How can I help you today?" The man's face turned sour. "What do you mean he doesn't work here?" "I've been buying cars from Robert for 12 years. "Where did he go?" Katie remained professional. "There have been some management changes recently. But I'd be happy to help you find your next vehicle. What are you looking for?" The man looked around the showroom, his eyes narrowing when he saw the diverse group of salespeople helping various customers. "Management changes," he muttered. "I can see what kind of changes. This place has gone downhill. I'll take my business elsewhere." He walked out without another word. Katie felt discouraged, but David had seen the whole thing. He walked over and put a hand on her shoulder. "You handled that perfectly. If someone's loyalty was to discrimination rather than good service, we're better off without their business." But it kept happening. Another longtime customer came in and made uncomfortable comments about the new crowd working there. A woman actually asked if the dealership was under new management, in a tone that made it clear she wasn't happy about the changes. David realized that some of the previous customers hadn't just been comfortable with the old way of doing things. They'd actually preferred it. Meanwhile, David's audit team had uncovered something bigger. They found evidence that Robert had been running a side scheme for almost 2 years. He'd been steering wealthy customers to a dealership across town owned by his wife's brother. In exchange, he was getting cash payments under the table. The amount was staggering. The dealership had lost over $2 million in potential sales because Robert was literally selling out his own employer. David contacted the authorities and turned over all the evidence. Within days, criminal charges were filed against Robert for fraud and embezzlement. When the story hit the news, it exploded. Local television stations ran segments about it. The headline read, "Former manager charged with fraud after discrimination scandal at local dealership." The publicity was overwhelming. David's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some calls were supportive. Community leaders thanked him for taking a stand. Other dealership owners quietly reached out, admitting they'd seen similar problems in their own businesses but hadn't known how to address them. But there were negative calls too. People accused David of destroying a man's life over one mistake. Anonymous messages called him names and suggested he was playing victim for publicity. The stress was getting to everyone. Trevor came to David's office one afternoon looking exhausted. "Boss, I had 3 customers today ask me if I was hired because of diversity quotas. Like I'm not actually qualified to be here." It's getting old. David understood that frustration deeply. "I know people are going to have opinions. But here's what I want you to remember. You're here because you're good at your job. Your sales numbers prove it. Your customer reviews prove it. Anyone who questions that isn't worth your energy." Katie was struggling too, but in a different way. As the new sales manager, she felt enormous pressure to prove herself. Some of the veteran salespeople who'd stayed were testing her authority, showing up late or cutting corners. She came to David almost in tears one evening. "I don't know if I can do this. Maybe you should get someone with more experience." David sat down across from her. "Katie, you know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who does the right thing even when it's hard. That's leadership. Experience will come with time, but integrity? You either have it or you don't. And you have it." The turning point came when David decided to host a community outreach event. He opened the dealership on a Sunday when they'd normally be closed and invited everyone to come. No pressure to buy anything. Just food, music, and a chance to see the changes for themselves. Over 300 people showed up. Families walked through the showroom, kids pressing their faces against car windows. Parents asking questions without fear of being judged. David set up tables where people could learn about financing options, get their credit questions answered, and understand the car buying process without any sales pressure. An elderly gentleman approached David late in the afternoon. His name was Walter, and he'd been a mechanic for 40 years before retiring. "I tried to buy a car here 3 years ago," Walter said quietly. "They took one look at me and decided I couldn't afford anything. Didn't even let me test drive. I had cash for a down payment and everything." David felt his heart sink. "I'm sorry that happened to you," Walter smiled. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. I'm telling you because today, your young salesman Phil spent an hour with me, showed me different models, explained all the features, treated me like I mattered. He didn't know I wasn't planning to buy today. He just treated me with respect." That's the difference. Stories like Walter's kept coming. A young woman named Destiny shared how she'd been saving for years to buy her first new car. She'd visited 4 dealerships and been treated poorly at each one, either ignored or patronized. "But today," she said, her eyes bright, "Trevor listened to what I needed, showed me options in my budget, and never made me feel bad about my price range. I'm coming back next month when I have my full down payment." David realized something important that day. The negative publicity and lost customers who wanted the old ways. They were loud, but they weren't the majority. For every person who complained about the changes, there were 3 more who were grateful for them. People who'd been turned away before were coming back. New customers were hearing about the dealership's transformation and wanting to support it. But the biggest surprise came from his own team. Phil, the salesman who'd admitted to going along with bad practices for years, had become one of the strongest advocates for the new approach. He'd started mentoring newer salespeople, teaching them not just how to sell cars but how to treat people right. One evening, after a particularly long day, Phil stopped by David's office. "Can I tell you something? I've been doing this job for 10 years. I made good money under Robert, but I dreaded coming to work every single day. Now I'm excited to be here. My wife says I'm a different person. Thank you for giving me a chance to be better." David felt emotion welling up in his chest. This was why he'd bought this place. Not for the money or the business expansion. For moments like this, for the chance to prove that doing business the right way wasn't just morally correct. It was actually better for everyone involved. As David locked up that night, he looked at the dealership with fresh eyes. The building looked the same on the outside. Same glass walls, same bright lights, same luxury cars on display, but everything that mattered had changed. The energy was different. The culture was different. The future was different. He got in his car and drove home, tired but satisfied. There was still work to do. Robert's criminal case was ongoing. Some customers were still adjusting to the changes, and building a truly inclusive culture would take time. But they were on the right path. Finally, they were on the right path. 6 months had passed since that day when David was kicked out of his own dealership. Standing in the showroom now, he barely recognized the place. Not because the building had changed, but because everything else had. The numbers told part of the story. Sales were up 49%. Customer satisfaction scores had jumped from 2 stars to 4.5. The dealership that was bleeding money was now one of the most profitable locations in David's entire network. But the real changes couldn't be measured in spreadsheets. On this particular morning, David watched as a young couple walked in with their toddler. The husband was wearing work boots and a construction company shirt. His wife had their daughter on her hip. 6 months ago, they probably would have been followed around like shoplifters or ignored completely. Today, Trevor greeted them with a genuine smile and offered the little girl a coloring book while her parents looked at vehicles. David had renamed the dealership Chen Premier Motors, making it the flagship location of his company. The building had been remodeled with an open floor plan that felt welcoming instead of intimidating. There were comfortable chairs, a kids' play area, and walls covered with photos of real customers from the community standing next to their new vehicles. Every face told a story of someone who'd been treated with respect. The legal situation with Robert had concluded the previous month. He'd pleaded guilty to fraud and embezzlement charges. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison and ordered him to pay back the money he'd stolen. His brother-in-law's dealership had also been investigated, though no charges were filed there. Several of Robert's former employees who'd enabled the discrimination had struggled to find work in the industry after word spread about what had happened. David didn't feel any satisfaction about Robert's downfall. There was no victory in watching someone's life fall apart, even someone who'd done wrong. But he did feel a quiet sense of justice. Actions had consequences, and maybe, just maybe, other managers would think twice before treating people the way Robert had. Katie had flourished as sales manager in ways that surprised even David. She'd developed a training program that other dealerships in his network were now adopting. She had a gift for spotting potential in people and helping them grow. Just last week, she'd been invited to speak at an industry conference about building inclusive sales teams. David couldn't have been prouder. Phil had become her right hand, mentoring new hires and showing them that you could be successful without compromising your values. His own sales numbers had actually improved after the changes. Turns out, when you treat everyone with respect, word spreads and people come back. The dealership had partnered with local organizations to offer first-time buyer programs and financial education workshops. Every month, they hosted free classes where people could learn about credit, financing, and the car buying process without any pressure to purchase. David wanted people to feel empowered, not intimidated. One afternoon, a teenager came in and stood staring at a luxury sedan in the showroom. He was maybe 16, wearing a school basketball uniform. David walked over with a smile. "Beautiful car, isn't it?" The kid nodded but looked nervous, like he thought he might be in trouble for just looking. "Yeah, it's amazing. I could never afford something like this, though." David's heart squeezed. He remembered being that age, dreaming about cars he thought were forever out of reach. "Not yet," David said. "But that doesn't mean you don't belong here. Come on, let me show you what's under the hood." The teenager's eyes went wide. "Really, you mean it?" For the next 20 minutes, David showed him the engine, explained how different systems worked, and talked about what it takes to achieve your dreams. The kid's name was Andre, and he wanted to be an engineer someday. David gave him his business card. "When you graduate and get that engineering degree, you come see me. We'll talk about getting you into a car you love." Andre left with a huge smile, and David knew that kid would remember this moment for the rest of his life. Not because of the car, but because someone took him seriously and treated him like he mattered. Later that evening, after most of the staff had gone home, David stood looking at a framed photo on his office wall. It was from the community event they'd held, showing dozens of families enjoying themselves in the showroom. People of every background, every age, every walk of life. That's what this place was supposed to be. His phone buzzed with a text from Walter, the retired mechanic who'd been treated poorly years ago. Walter had come back last month and bought a car from Phil. The text was simple. "Just wanted to say thank you again. My granddaughter saw me driving my new car and said, 'Grandpa, you look so happy.' I am happy. You made that possible." David had to wipe his eyes. This was why he did what he did. Not for the profit margins or the business expansion. For moments like this. For the chance to prove that treating people right wasn't just the moral choice, it was the better choice in every way. Katie knocked on his office door. "Hey boss, got a minute?" "Always, what's up?" She sat down, looking thoughtful. "I was just thinking about that day everything changed. When you got kicked out and then came back as the owner. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't bought this place, if things would have just continued the way they were." David leaned back in his chair. Someone else would have bought it eventually. Maybe they would have made changes, maybe not. But I'll tell you what I've learned. Change doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone decides they're not okay with the way things are and does something about it. Do you ever think about that day? How it felt? Katie asked. "Every single day," David admitted. "But not the way you might think. Yeah, it was humiliating and hurtful, but it also showed me exactly what was broken here. If I'd walked in as the owner the first day, with everyone on their best behavior, I might have missed it. Sometimes you need to see things from the worst angle to understand how to fix them." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Through the office window, they could see Trevor helping an elderly couple fill out paperwork. Phil was showing a young family the safety features on an SUV. Everyone was being treated with the same respect and attention. "You know what the best part is?" David finally said. 6 months ago, what happened to me was normal here. It was just another day. Now, it would be unthinkable. Not because I'm the owner, but because we've built a culture where that kind of treatment isn't acceptable for anyone. Katie smiled. "We've come a long way." "We have," David agreed. "But the work isn't done. Culture isn't something you fix once and forget about. It's something you maintain every single day. Every interaction, every customer, every decision. That's how you build something that lasts. As Katie left and David prepared to head home, he took one last look around the dealership. The lights were dimming, the showroom was quiet, but it felt alive in a way it never had before. This wasn't just a place that sold cars anymore. It was a place where people were treated with dignity, where dreams felt possible, where everyone belonged. David had been humiliated on this property 6 months ago, judged by nothing more than the color of his skin and the clothes he wore. But he'd turned that pain into purpose. He'd transformed anger into action. And in doing so, he'd created something meaningful. Not everyone gets a second chance to right a wrong. Not everyone has the power to change a broken system. But David had both, and he'd used them well. The dealership that had rejected him was now a beacon of what business could be when you led with integrity instead of prejudice. As he walked to his car, David smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new customers, new opportunities to prove that doing the right thing was always worth it, and he was ready for all of it.